He stood in her kitchen with a silver spoon raised halfway to his mouth, and for the first time in what was surely a long and opinionated life, he had nothing to say. Not a word, not a syllable, not even the small preparatory sound a man makes when he is about to correct someone. The spoon hovered. The honey caught the afternoon light coming through the single window, caught it and held it, the way amber holds things, completely, without apology, dark as autumn creek water, darker than anything that had come out of this valley in living memory. She watched him from across the table, her hands folded, her expression giving nothing away. She had been giving things away all summer, and she was finished with it. He took the spoon the rest of the way to his mouth. And then the silence came down like weather. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, as good stories tend to do. The honey deserved that entrance. The story that made it does not. That story begins 3 months earlier, in the unremarkable way that most difficult things begin, with hail. The storm came on a Tuesday afternoon in late June, which is perhaps the cruelest time for hail to arrive in Montana, when the summer is young and confident, and has not yet learned that the sky does not care about its plans. It came fast and it came sideways, and it came with the particular fury of weather that has no grievance but causes grievance anyway. By the time it passed, the meadow grass lay flat and silver, and more than half the hive frames on the property had been split, cracked, or scattered like the ambitions of a man who has not been careful. She stood at the edge of the apiary afterward, boots dark with wet earth, and surveyed what remained. What remained was not much. Her father was east, had been east since April, gone to recover from a lung illness that had started quietly and then decided to be serious about itself. He had left her with the hives, the equipment, the small reputation the family had built over a decade of careful beekeeping, and a list of instructions written in his precise, schoolteacher hand, as though the bees would also read it and comply. They had not complied. The hail had not complied, and the man from town, she knew, would arrive within the week. He always arrived within the week when there was something to be gotten cheaply. She had met him twice before, once when her father sold him a season's surplus, and once when he came to look at the property with the particular, roving gaze of a man calculating what things might be worth without the people who made them valuable. He was not cruel. He was simply in the habit of arriving after storms and offering reasonable prices for unreasonable situations and finding that people accepted them because the alternative was harder to imagine. She had begun, that Tuesday evening, to imagine it anyway. The morning after a hailstorm has a particular kind of silence to it, not the silence of peace, but the silence of a world that has said everything it intended to say and now waits, indifferent, to see what you will do with the wreckage. She was up before the light had fully committed to the sky. She had not slept well, had not slept much at all, and she moved through the pale gray dawn in her work clothes, pulling on her veil and gloves more from habit than from any belief that there was something left to protect. The hives sat where she had left them, as hives always do. But 3 of the longer frames had caved entirely, the wood split clean through by ice that had fallen with the casual violence of something that had never heard of consequence. Wax had scattered across the grass in pale, broken pieces, already beginning to draw flies. 2 of the supers had tipped and not recovered. The entrance reducers on 4 colonies were blocked with debris, and she could hear, or imagined she could hear, the uneven, uncertain hum of populations that had been frightened and diminished in a single afternoon. She walked the line slowly. She did not rush the looking. Her father would have made a list. He made lists the way other men made prayers, methodically, with complete faith that the act of recording a problem would eventually become the act of solving it. She did not have paper with her, so she made the list in her head instead. 6 frames unsalvageable, 2 colonies too weakened to winter without intervention, 1 queen she could not account for, and a quantity of capped honey lost to cracked comb and wet ground. Not everything, but close enough to everything that the difference felt unkind. Down in the valley, The town was already deciding. She knew this without needing to go there. Towns made up their minds about misfortune quickly, and the conclusion they generally reached was that misfortune was a kind of verdict. The apiary had always been a modest thing, respected, but modest, and modest things, when they broke, were assumed to be broken permanently. She had caught the edge of it already, a neighbor's wife at the fence line 2 days before the storm, mentioning casually that beekeeping was hard enough for a man, let alone a girl keeping the work going solo. She had smiled and said nothing. She was practiced at smiling and saying nothing. The surviving colonies hummed their uncertain hum. She crouched beside the nearest hive and pressed 2 fingers against the wood, not to check anything, not to listen for something specific, but because she had learned, young, that bees can feel steadiness through the walls of their home, and that steadiness, even false steadiness, matters when everything else is shaken. Her fingers were very still. Whatever the town was deciding down in the valley, whatever the man from town was planning behind his ledger and his reasonable prices, she had until the end of the week to think. She intended to use every hour of it. He arrived on Thursday. She had known he would come before the week was out. Men like him kept to schedules the way rivers keep to channels, not from discipline exactly, but because deviation cost them something they disliked losing. His wagon rolled up the slope just after mid-morning, when the light was still flat and the air held the particular stillness of a valley that has not yet decided what kind of day it intends to be. 2 horses, both gray, a ledger tucked under one arm when he climbed down, as though the numbers inside it had already been written. He was not unkind in his manner, that was worth noting. He greeted her with his hat removed and his tone measured, and he looked at the damaged frames the storm had left with an expression that managed to be both sympathetic and entirely devoid of surprise. She had the sense he had made this particular trip before, not to this homestead, but to this situation, and that he had learned long ago how to stand inside someone else's misfortune without being moved by it. He spoke at length. He mentioned the market, the late season, the cost of requeening weakened colonies, the difficulty of winter feeding for hives that had lost structural integrity. He mentioned, with apparent reluctance, the price he was prepared to offer, a figure that named each surviving colony at roughly what one might pay for the wood alone. He called it fair given the circumstances. He called it more than fair. He said the word 3 times, the way a man will repeat a word when he is not entirely comfortable with it. She listened to all of it. She stood with her hands loosely at her sides, her expression attentive and unhurried, and she let him finish without interruption. She nodded once, near the end, which he may have taken as agreement, because he glanced down at his ledger as though he was about to open it. She thanked him. The words were simple and genuine. She thanked him for the ride up the slope, for his time, for explaining the market conditions so clearly. Her voice did not waver, her expression did not change, and then, without anger, without ceremony, without anything that might be called a dramatic pause, she declined. The refusal was so quiet that it took him a moment. He had already begun to reach for his ledger. He stopped. He looked at her with the slightly unfocused expression of a man who has walked into a room and cannot immediately locate what he came for. "I beg your pardon," he said. She repeated herself, still gently. She would not be selling the colonies, not at present. She was grateful for his offer, and she wished him a safe ride back to town. He stood there for a moment longer than was comfortable. The hives behind her made their low, continuous sound, something between breathing and humming, something that belonged entirely to them, and she let the silence do the rest. He left the way men like him always leave, with dignity maintained and confusion buried somewhere beneath the collar, where it would not show until he was alone on the road. She watched the wagon until it disappeared behind the tree line. Then she turned back to the hives. The bees did not care that she had refused him. They had not paused for his offer, or for her decline, or for the particular quality of the silence that had followed both. They continued their low, purposeful work, in and out, in and out, as though the matter had never concerned them. She found this steadying. She found it, in truth, a great relief. But steadying was not the same as sufficient. She knew that. The colonies that had survived were not strong. The storm had left them confused and depleted, their numbers reduced, their foraging range disrupted by the broken frames and the scattered comb. She had done what she could in the days since, resealing, repairing, consolidating the weakest colonies into the frames of the strongest, but forage was the true difficulty. The valley meadow near the house had been stripped by the hail as thoroughly as the hives themselves. The clover that usually fed them through midsummer lay flattened and waterlogged, still trying to recover. The bees needed range. They needed something she was not sure the land could offer. She spent the following days mending the outer fence line, the eastern boundary of the property, where one of the posts had split clean through in the storm and two sections of wire had come down entirely. It was slow work and solitary, and it carried her farther up the slope than she usually traveled. The terrain changed there. The grasses grew coarser, the air thinner and brighter, the smell of the land itself different, something resinous beneath the warmth, something wild. She almost walked past the hollow without seeing it. It was tucked below a natural fold in the hillside, sheltered on three sides by a low granite shelf that curved around it like a cupped hand. The hailstorm had passed over or around it. She could not be certain which, but the evidence was plain. Inside the hollow, nothing was flattened. The mountain clover stood thick and undamaged, its pale blooms so dense they blurred together at a distance. And between the clover, pushing up through the rocky soil with quiet insistence, grew sage, true mountain sage, not the silvered scrub of the lower slopes, but the deep-rooted, resinous kind that bloomed slowly and kept its oil long into autumn. She stopped. She stood at the edge of the hollow and looked down into it, and the bees, her bees, or some of them, drawn perhaps by instinct or by the warm air rising from the protected ground, moved past her in a slow, golden current, descending toward the clover with the calm certainty of creatures who had already made their decision. She had not told a soul she was this far up the slope. She did not intend to. She did not move them all at once. That was the first decision, and it was a practical one. A single woman carrying full hive boxes across rough terrain in one long effort would exhaust herself before the work was done, and exhausted hands made mistakes. Mistakes with bees were the kind that stung in more ways than one. So she made a plan the way her father had always taught her to make plans, quietly, in sequence, without announcing it to anyone. She began at first light on the second morning after she found the hollow. The town below would not stir for another hour. The light came in flat and pale from the east, thin as paper, casting no shadows yet, only a general brightening of the world that made the grass look silver and the granite look like bone. She worked in that early quiet with the methodical calm of someone who has already accepted that the task will take as long as it takes. The nearest surviving hive she carried on a board she had stripped from the broken frame pile, a slow and careful thing, 2 hands braced beneath it, arms steady, pace measured. She had wrapped the entrance with a damp cloth the night before to keep the colony settled through the journey. Even so, she felt the low vibration of them through the wood, not angry, not alarmed, simply present, humming the particular hum of a colony that does not yet know where it is going. She set the first box at the clover's edge and stood back. The bees emerged before she had walked 10 paces. They did not circle in confusion the way bees sometimes do when disoriented. They poured out in a short, decisive arc, dipped once toward the ground as though testing the air, and then rose and moved directly into the clover as if they had known it was there all along. She watched them for a long moment. Then she walked back down the slope for the second box. Over the next several mornings she repeated this, always at dawn, always alone, always unhurried. Some boxes were lighter than she expected, the colonies so reduced by the storm's disruption that lifting them required almost no effort, and this was a grief of its own kind, a quiet grief. She allowed herself only as far as the next 10 paces. Others were heavier, the surviving colonies having managed, even in their diminished state, to hold their numbers together. These she carried slowly, stopping once or twice on the slope to breathe and rebalance, her arms aching and her boots slipping on the dew-wet grass, and she said nothing to anyone about the ache or the slipping because there was no one to say it to. The hollow received each box without ceremony. She positioned them along the clover's border with care, not too close together, not so far apart that the colonies would feel isolated. The sage grew thick between them. The morning air coming off the granite shelf was warmer than the open slope, strangely warm, as though the stone itself had been holding heat through the night. She noticed that too, and filed it quietly away. The bees found the clover on the third day. She did not see it happen. She was at the far end of the fence line, replacing a post that the storm had loosened from its footing, when she paused and looked back toward the hollow and understood, from the particular quality of the air above it, that something had changed. The hum was different, not louder exactly, but fuller, the way a room sounds different when more people have entered it quietly while your back was turned. She stood there a moment with the post driver resting against her hip, watching the distant shimmer of wings above the clover heads, and then she went back to the fence. That was patience, or something close enough to it that the difference did not matter. Weeks moved the way weeks do in late summer on the Montana foothills, not fast, not slow, but with a kind of geological indifference to human preference. The mornings cooled a degree at a time. The light shifted its angle. The clover bloomed in successive waves, one variety releasing as another opened, and the sage between the hives silvered and deepened its scent as the season matured. She checked the frames twice a week, lifting the covers with the same deliberate care she had carried the boxes down the slope. No haste, no rough movements, no announcement of herself that the colonies did not invite. The frames were filling, slowly enough that impatience would have been a reasonable response, and she was not without it, but filling all the same. The wax was pale at first, nearly white, the new comb drawn out with the thin, tentative precision of creatures rebuilding what they had not expected to need to rebuild. Then darker, then sealed. She pressed her thumb lightly to one capped cell and felt the faint warmth beneath it and thought, "They are doing what they were made to do, which is more than most things manage." In town, a quieter kind of judgment was replacing the first. The pity, which had arrived quickly and attached itself to her like burrs to wool, had begun to wear off when she did not appear to require anything from it. She had not sent for help. She had not sold the operation. She had not written east to her father asking to be excused from the summer's aftermath. The general store owner had offered to connect her with a buyer from the next county, a man known to purchase struggling apiaries whole. She had thanked him plainly and declined without explanation. This confused people. Confusion, she had learned, was a more useful condition than pity. Pity expected collapse and applauded when it arrived. Confusion had to wait and see. She let them wait. The most defiant thing she had done all summer was not moving the hives in the dark before dawn, or finding the hollow, or keeping its location entirely to herself. It was the waiting itself, patient, deliberate, and entirely without apology. She waited the way the granite shelf waited, with the heat already stored inside it. It was the middle of September when his wagon appeared on the road. She saw it from the far side of the property, where she had been checking the gate post for rot, a useful task she had invented for herself, since she had no other reason to be standing where she could see the road without appearing to watch it. The wagon moved at the pace of a man with an appointment he had already mentally completed. He had told himself something, she understood, before he arrived. He had decided the shape of this visit and was simply riding into the confirmation. She walked back toward the gate at the same unhurried pace she walked everywhere now. He pulled up. He looked at the homestead first, the fences, the repaired outbuildings, the yard swept clean, and she could see him adjusting something in his expression. He had expected more evidence of failure. Ruin was easier to read than order, and order on a small operation after a bad storm required a kind of revision he had not budgeted for. He was a man accustomed to reading situations the way he read ledgers, in columns, totals, final lines. The homestead did not balance the way he had anticipated. He touched the brim of his hat. She gave him a single nod. He said he had been in the area on business. He said he had heard she was still keeping bees. He said it mildly, the way a man says a thing he already believes cannot be entirely true. She told him she was. He waited. She offered nothing further. He asked, with the careful lightness of a man who did not wish to appear curious, how the hives were faring after the summer. She looked at him for a moment, not a long moment, not a theatrical one, simply the length of a moment in which a woman decides exactly how much to give a man who has come to collect information the way he came once before to collect bees at scrap value. She said the hives were doing. A word with edges so smooth it gave him nothing to grip. He nodded slowly. He glanced once toward the back of the property, where the yard ended and the hillside began to rise. She did not follow his glance. She kept her eyes on him, which was, she had found, the most efficient way to keep a man from seeing anything you did not wish him to see. People looked away when they were hiding something. She looked directly at him and hid everything. He asked if she intended to bring any honey to market this season. She said she expected to, yes, when the time was right. He said nothing to that, which was itself a kind of speech, the sound of a man who had arrived certain and was leaving uncertain, and did not know what to do with the difference. He touched his hat again and turned the wagon. She stood at the gate until the road curved and took him out of sight. Then she went back to checking the post for rot. Autumn came to the Montana foothills the way it always did, not all at once but in suggestions, a cold that lingered past noon, a particular slant of light that turned the hillside grasses from green to something closer to bronze. The mornings arrived earlier in their darkness, and the evenings left sooner, and somewhere between the two, she began to feel the season pulling at her, the way a tide pulls at things left near the water's edge. She had been watching the hives for weeks, not with anxiety. She had spent all her anxiety in the early days, had used it up entirely, and what replaced it was something steadier. She watched the way a person watches a thing they have come to trust. The bees had grown heavy with purpose through the long summer, working the hidden meadow in their private, tireless way, and she had not hurried them. She had not hurried herself. She had let the season do what seasons are designed to do, and now autumn was settling its cool hand over the hillside, and the bees were slowing, and she understood the time had come. She pulled the first frame on a morning when the sky was the color of pewter and the sage smell drifted down from the slope on a wind that carried just enough cold to be honest about what was coming. The frame was heavy, heavier than any frame she had lifted from her father's hives in prior years, heavier than she had let herself hope. She carried it to the workbench she had built from salvaged fence posts and set it down with the care one gives to things that have earned their weight. The honey that ran from the uncapped cells was not the pale gold of valley honey. It was not even the deeper amber she had occasionally seen from hives set near buckwheat or goldenrod. It was darker than that, darker than she had words ready for, a color that sat somewhere between mahogany and old copper, rich and almost secretive, as though the clover and sage had consulted with each other and agreed to give everything they had to something they believed would be kept safe. She pressed the back of her hand against it without thinking, the way you touch something to test whether it is real. The warmth surprised her. She raised her hand and breathed in the fragrance that clung to her skin, and her hand stopped moving. There was no one to tell. She knew this. She was alone on the property with a pewter sky above her and a hillside behind her that would not speak, and she did not need anyone to confirm what she was holding. She knew what she was holding. She pressed the honey slowly into jars, 5 of them, her hands steady and unhurried. When the first jar was filled and sealed, she wiped it clean with a cloth and held it up to the gray morning light. She said nothing. She carried it inside and set it on the kitchen shelf, where it sat like a fact she had not yet decided to share. The neighbor came for water. That was all. A simple errand on a dry afternoon. Her wagon had raised a column of pale dust along the fence road, and she had stopped because the well was closer than the creek, and she had been out since morning. Clara offered the dipper, and then, because the woman looked tired and the day had grown warm, she offered shade and a moment's rest on the porch step. She did not plan to offer anything else. But there was a jar on the kitchen shelf, and when the neighbor followed her inside to wash the dust from her hands, she saw it. The dark honey catching the afternoon light through the window glass in a way that made it look less like a pantry item and more like something that had been lit from within. "What is that?" the neighbor said. And Clara, without ceremony, opened it and handed her a spoon. The silence that followed lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. The neighbor stood with the spoon at her lips, and then past her lips, and then she set the spoon down with the slow deliberateness of someone setting down something breakable. She looked at the jar. She looked at Clara. She looked at the jar again. "Where?" she began, and then did not finish the question. Clara said only that it was this season's. The neighbor did not press. But she did not stop talking about it. Not that afternoon when she reached the mill road. Not the following morning when she stopped at the dry goods store. Not 3 days later, when she found herself describing the color of it, the warmth of it, the way it had tasted like something she did not have words for, something between the end of summer and the memory of it. Word of this kind travels in the way that water travels through limestone, not noisily, but certainly finding every crack. By the end of that week, 2 women had appeared at Clara's gate, politely, hat in hand, so to speak, asking whether she had any extra jars she might be willing to part with. She told them honestly that she had not decided yet what she intended to do with the honey. They thanked her and left, and she watched their wagon roll back toward the valley with a quiet sensation she did not immediately recognize as power. More came. Not all at once, but steadily, the way interest accumulates when no one is trying to stop it. She had 5 jars. She had told no one she had 5 jars. She had told no one where the hives now stood, or what grew near them, or what the hillside looked like in morning light when the bees were already moving. She had told no one anything. And still they came. The town that had pitied her in August was asking her permission in October, and she had not said a word to anyone to cause it. He came back in November. She had known he would, not because he had promised it exactly, but because men like him kept their appointments with what they believed they owned, and he still believed he had some claim here, some prior arrangement the storm had interrupted but not erased. He pulled his wagon up the lane on a morning when the frost had not yet fully lifted from the grass, his ledger tucked under one arm and his collar turned against the cold, and he wore the expression of a man arriving to settle an account. She let him in. Not out of deference. Out of interest, the way a person opens a window to see what the weather has decided to do. He stood in her kitchen and looked around with the particular attention of someone cataloging what remains after a setback, a habit of his trade, she supposed, always measuring what was left against what had been. He asked after the hives. She told him they were managing. He asked whether she had made any arrangements for the honey. She told him she was considering her options. He opened his ledger. She put the kettle on. It was a small room, a practical room. The shelves held what they needed to hold, and nothing decorative, except that on the table beside the window, where the light came in strongest even in November, there sat a jar. One jar. Dark as creek water in shadow, dark as the inside of something living. The honey pressed against the glass with a density that made it look less poured than settled, as though it had arrived at its final form through patience rather than process. She had set it there that morning without thinking much about why. It was the jar she had kept for herself, the one she had decided, in some unspoken way, was not for sale. He saw it. She watched him see it. Watched the ledger slow in his hands, watched his eyes move from the shelf to the table to the jar with the involuntary precision of a man who knows quality before he can explain why. He did not ask permission. He crossed to the table, which was not quite rude, but was not quite not rude either, and he picked up the jar and held it toward the window. The light came through it like something filtered through autumn itself, amber at the edges, almost black at the center, with a depth that made the ordinary honey he traded in look, by comparison, like water pretending to be something more. He said something. She no longer remembered what. It was the last thing he said for some time. Because then he reached for the spoon she had left on the table beside it. Her spoon, for her jar, in her kitchen, and he tasted it. And the room went quiet, in a way that had nothing to do with sound. He set the spoon down. Not quickly, not with any performance of drama. He set it down the way a man sets down something he does not entirely trust himself to hold, with a care that was more reverent than he had intended to show, and more honest than he knew how to retract. The jar was still in his other hand. He looked at it. He looked at it the way men look at things that have rearranged something in them without asking leave to do so. She did not speak. She had learned, in the months since the storm, that the most powerful thing a person could do in a room was simply not fill it. He cleared his throat. It was the sound of a man who had arrived with a speech prepared and discovered it no longer fit the occasion. He set the jar down beside the spoon. He looked at the window. He looked at the shelf with its row of sealed jars, each one the same amber dark as the one he had just tasted, each one carrying the same deep, unhurried complexity that had apparently rendered him a man who spoke at length and often, briefly without words. The silence was not uncomfortable. She noticed this. She filed it away. When he finally spoke, he did not look at her directly. He looked at the jar. "Triple," he said. His standard rate. And triple it. Every jar she could produce this season and the next. He would clear his existing contracts, he said, because what she had was, and here he paused, reaching for a word that would not embarrass him, unlike anything currently moving through the valley. He said it quietly, which was perhaps the most surprising thing he had done since arriving. She listened to all of it. She let him finish completely, and then she was quiet for a moment longer, not from hesitation, but from the simple authority of a woman who has decided she will not be rushed through her own terms. When she spoke, it was without apology and without haste. Her price, she said, not his offer, her price, which she would name, and he would either accept or decline. He blinked. Her schedule, she continued. The honey would be ready when the season permitted it, and when her judgment confirmed it, and not before either condition was satisfied. He opened his mouth. She continued. And her right, she said, to sell to whom she chose, should she ever choose differently. She did not say it as a threat. She said it the way one states a fact about weather or geography, a condition of the landscape that would not be altered by his feelings on the matter. He looked at her then, fully, perhaps for the first time since he had walked through her door. The ledger in his hands had gone entirely forgotten. He accepted. Not immediately. There was a moment where his pride required him to shift his weight and look out the window and consider the middle distance as though it contained some better option. It did not. The window held only the quiet slope of her land, the late afternoon light falling gold across the grass, and somewhere beyond the ridge, hidden from any road and known to no one but herself, a meadow that had done what she had always believed it could do. He accepted her terms, all of them, he said so plainly, which she took as evidence that he was capable of learning. She gave him nothing else that day, no tour, no explanation, no softening of the arrangement with pleasantries. She walked him to the door with the same composure she had carried since the moment he first arrived months ago, expecting to take what was already half broken. He left with a promise in his pocket and not a single jar in his hands. She stood on the porch and watched the wagon grow small. The road absorbed him slowly, the way the valley absorbed all things that did not belong to it. At first present, then distant, then simply part of the land's long exhale. She watched until the sound of the wheels faded beneath the wind in the grass. Then she went inside. The last jar of the season sat on the kitchen table where she had placed it that morning, the glass still faintly warm from the pouring, the wax seal set and smooth. She had labeled it in her own hand, not for him, not for the market, not for any ledger or invoice or agreement. She picked it up and turned it once in the light. The honey moved inside it the way honey does, slowly, like something that has decided it will not be hurried by anyone. She found a spoon. She opened the jar, not to assess the batch, not to confirm the quality, not to measure whether it had met some standard she had worried over. She opened it because this moment was hers, and she intended to know it completely before she set it down and moved on to whatever came next. The honey was dark and warm, and tasted of clover and sage, and the long, dry summer, and the storm that had tried to end it all before it began. She held it there a moment, still, the way you hold something you have earned. There is a particular kind of tending that the world rarely notices, the kind done in private, through damage, without applause or audience, or any promise that it will come to anything at all. The world writes those efforts off early and moves on to more certain investments. But sometimes, in a meadow no one else has found, in frames no one believed were worth saving, something builds quietly in the dark and comes out gold.